Thank you for watching. My name's Glenn Morgan, and this is We the Govern. Today we're going to be talking about malfeasance, misfeasance, and nonfeasance. What's the difference, and why does it matter? Okay, as we mentioned earlier, malfeasance, misfeasance, nonfeasance. What is it? These are words that we hear all the time if you're an activist, when you're referring to the incompetence or the corruption of government and bureaucrats. Those words come up frequently. So what we hope to do is explain what the difference is and why it matters to you. Now, this context usually comes up around recall elections. That's like the most common way that I usually hear these words used. And in this case, I featured Governor Inslee from Washington State here, but people will say, hey, how come we can't recall this guy? Or what do we need to do to recall him? What do we have to do? And so the idea of malfeasance and misfeasance frequently comes up. It also sometimes comes up in the context of stories that we've told recently about, for instance, in this case, it's the director, Laura Watson, for the Department of Ecology in Washington State. And under her watch, the fact that the front yard of that agency turned into one big unlicensed landfill and turned into a big toxic waste pile and a huge mess. So was she a malfeasant, or was it misfeasance, or exactly what the heck was she doing allowing that to happen on her watch at the state agency? So in order to better understand that, and when you're talking about these topics, the important thing, I think, is to understand the definitions and then to apply them to real-life situations that we have around us all the time. So when we talk about malfeasance, let's talk about this. This is the one that sounds the worst, and it's the one we oftentimes hear used all the time when we're referring to elected officials, and that's because it refers to wrongdoing or misconduct, especially by a public official. And it does have a slightly different meaning when you use it in a civil case, but generally the malfeasance term that we're referring to here, it usually has to be illegal. It has to be something that was illegal, that's not lawful that they did, like bribery or something like that. It has to be intentional. It has to be something that they did with a purpose. They knew it was illegal and they did it anyway. And usually, at least in the context of a public official, that it causes harm to somebody. The public is harmed, some special interest group is harmed, somebody's harmed by the actions they take. And malfeasance can be really bad. It can be bribery, right? It can be all kinds of activities and actions that could result in prison sentences and significant charges brought against those elected officials or the bureaucrats. Malfeasance is not something that you want to be charged with if you're an elected official. And it is one of the things that serves as an adequate reason to have a recall petition filed against you. So one of the reasons and the ways that this would come up would be a good example here of Governor Inslee. He decided last year during the fire season in eastern Washington to bring over illegal maggot apples. He grew these apparently, or at least he claimed he grew them at on his property, and decided that the best thing people who were trying to recover from fires needed was some apples that he grew. And he went over and he violated the apple maggot pest-free area, the quarantine area in eastern Washington. And the reason why this matters a lot is that the apple business is a huge business in eastern Washington where they sell billions and billions of dollars worth of apples, and it provides employment to tens of thousands of people all over eastern Washington. It's quite a big agricultural business, one of the biggest ones in Washington State. And so to have a pest like this released into those areas could cause great devastation to the farmers and the people whose jobs rely on a pest-free apple that you're trying to sell all around the world. But Governor Inslee violated this law, and he brought these apples, maggot apples, over there, and he gave them out in a variety of communities in eastern Washington last year. So the question is, did Governor Inslee break the law when we're looking at malfeasance, for example? And the answer to that is absolutely. He did break the law. There's no doubt about it. So one of the check boxes in a malfeasance claim is answered there. Was it willful? And now, this is a good question because we have to decide, did Governor Inslee knowingly introduce apple maggots to eastern Washington communities? You know, did he really purposely go back there and hand out these apple maggots knowing that he was going to destroy the agricultural community and wipe out the livelihood of tens of thousands of people and really cause great harm in that community? So in order for us to have a malfeasance charge that you could bring against him, he'd have to knowingly have done it. So that means that he would have to have said, yes, I'm going to go do this. Those guys didn't vote for me anyway, so forget them. I'm just going to go and dump these into their community and see what happens. But so that would be malfeasance for sure if that's what he decided he was going to do. However, if it was an accident, then it's something else. And if it was something that he didn't willfully mean to violate, then it's going to be what we would call misfeasance. So misfeasance is kind of that next level down violation, but they oftentimes get lumped together. But misfeasance is the act of engaging in an action or duty, but failing to perform the duty properly or correctly. And misfeasance usually refers to an action that's unintentional most of the time. And so this would be a situation where it's an accident. In fact, misfeasance is so common in local government that to find it, all you have to do is look. People oftentimes make mistakes and screw things up on such a regular basis that it's usually considered just a regular way government operates all the time. Misfeasance is very, very common. Malfeasance, again, that higher standard is a little bit more difficult to prove because you have to genuinely demonstrate that it's illegal and they're willfully trying to go do something. But misfeasance, that happens all the time in government. And so it's likely that Governor Inslee committed misfeasance with his action going over there, taking those apples to Eastern Washington. And of course, this comes up, again, as we mentioned earlier, because people oftentimes want to run recall petitions. They're disappointed or they're upset with the elected officials, and they really want to get them out of office as soon as possible. We hear about Governor Newsom being recalled down in California and other recall efforts that are going on around the country. Most states allow for recall efforts, and in Washington State, it's under RCW 29A 56.110 all the way through 270. If you actually read the statute, you don't want to get into the details. But it provides 3 basic reasons that you could do a recall election on an elected official: malfeasance and misfeasance, which we discussed already, and an oath of office violation, which is, I'm not going to get into that right here. It's a little bit of a different, we're kind of going down a little different topic when we get into the oath of office. But misfeasance is usually not a super high threshold. You can actually prove that most of the time. And so once people kind of figure out what they need in order to justify filing a recall petition, then they'll oftentimes try to proceed with that. I will point out in Washington State, we have a slightly different process than California or other places because it requires a number of different judges here to sign off on it before it would get approved to go to the ballot. And those tend to be higher bars or higher thresholds, really, than what the statute even specifically says. Judges have kind of taken on themselves to protect the political class in this state, unless you're a Republican. And so then it becomes a little bit more difficult process than you might otherwise think. Okay, let's get into the less commonly used nonfeasance. And nonfeasance really just means a failure to perform an act that is required by law. And this is exceptionally common in government because it's hard enough to get them to do their job right, and it's not too hard to have them just not do their job at all. That is actually pretty common, and so that's what allows bureaucracy to commit nonfeasance on a regular basis. They just don't do their job, even though the law says they're supposed to. So this is something that does frustrate people on a regular basis. Why don't they do their job? Well, it's nonfeasance if they don't do their job, but there tends to be no consequences for this because under the public duty doctrine, which really just says a duty to all is a duty to no one, it generally absolves elected officials, bureaucracies, and pretty much anybody involved in government from getting into trouble for not doing their job. Now, there's some exceptions to that, but the origin of this idea really goes back to the sovereign immunity kind of idea that you can't sue the government. They're immune to any liability based on their failure to act. And so this is an issue that comes up, and people easily get confused between nonfeasance, which is just another day at the office for government, and misfeasance, which is when they unintentionally screw up or they take an action that's mistakenly causes harm or causes some other damage. So this is something that is worth understanding and worth knowing these different levels and what they mean. So let's talk about maybe a practical application of this in analyzing an action that most people would think was pretty bad. And we'll go back to the Department of Ecology example that I mentioned earlier with Laura Watson, the director there. So under her watch, right, the whole campus became, a massive landfill, toxic waste dump. on their front property. And this is, of course, absurd and ridiculous because these are the environmental agencies that are supposed to protect the environment. And this is what their front yard looks like. This is how they turn their green spaces into a complete disaster. Bike chop shops on the Department of Ecology campus, and small vehicles with oil and battery acid and garbage being dumped into the salmon stream, open pit latrines, just big messes, okay? And Director Laura Watson was in charge of the Department of Ecology this whole time while it was piling up. They could see it from their offices. They had to drive by it every day. It's getting worse all the time, and only when they were confronted about it and were embarrassed enough about it, they finally partially cleaned it up. They didn't even completely clean it up. But when you look at something like this, which most people will be disgusted by, and understanding that under her watch she polluted the entire watershed, they probably polluted a salmon stream, they polluted downstream wells, all these other problems came about because of what happened at the Department of Ecology property. So you could only say, though, that she committed malfeasance if, for example, she specifically invited these people to come and the garbage dumpers to get on the property and then use it as an unlicensed landfill site. If she actively went out and solicited them and said, hey, come to the Department of Ecology, you can dump your garbage and nobody cares, then she would be committing malfeasance. That's an action she'd be taking, and it'd be requesting people to do something illegal and as a result, causing pollution. Or maybe another example of malfeasance would be if she decided to look the other way and maybe took payouts or bribes and split the meth proceeds from the illegal meth labs that were being run on their campus. Or perhaps if she shared the theft ring profits from the bike chop shops or the vehicle chop shops that were being set up on their property. In cases like this would be obvious malfeasance. If you could prove that she did something like this, then she would have committed malfeasance, would probably be facing something far worse than a recall election, probably more like jail time, and she would actually be getting into a lot more trouble if you could prove that she committed malfeasance. Or you could say that maybe she committed misfeasance if she decided to direct employees or staff members to pretend that they couldn't clean up the environment or protect the salmon habitat on their own property, while at the same time attacking farmers and small property owners around the state for far less significant problems like the potential to pollute on their property. Now, that's an action that she would have been taking to tell them, hey, don't do anything about these people, let the garbage dumping continue. That would be an action that she would take, and if she took some kind of action like that, but it wasn't clear that she was intentionally trying to violate the law, then you could say that was misfeasance, and that's a relatively low bar. I think it's a fairly easy argument to make that she probably did commit misfeasance, but you'd have to go in and dig a little deeper and find out if misfeasance was committed there. Now, there's no doubt that nonfeasance was committed, and that's why I use that term when I've discussed this in this situation in previous videos, where she just chose to ignore the pollution and just not do her job. After all, her primary job, in theory, is to keep the environment, protect the environment. Supposedly, that's what this agency was created for, and she decided to just drive right by, watch the pollution, the toxic waste, and everything, just the garbage turn into a landfill. She just thought that was an appropriate use for their green space and decided to do nothing about it. That would be nonfeasance. And so in any of these cases, you'd still be frustrated, but in malfeasance, she'd be going to jail. If it was one of these others, it's a little less clear how much trouble they'd get into. There are some exceptions, again, because it's likely that they caused great harm to people downstream from them, and so there may be a class action case that they could legally bring against her in the agency, but that's a separate story. It's just more of looking at the story and understanding how these three different elements of bad behavior by government officials would apply. And that's the best way to look at how I would separate those in this case. Of course, the question is, why does it matter? And again, I'm going to come back to one of the things that does matter, because this is one of the comments that comes up when people are talking about malfeasance and misfeasance, is that if you want to file a recall election on somebody, you better find a way to carefully document and categorize whatever specific violations are that elected official made and document it so that you can classify it into this malfeasance, misfeasance, or perhaps a nonfeasance category. Now, nonfeasance isn't a good enough category in most states to have a recall petition, and some states may not allow misfeasance, but since Washington State, where I live, allows both, it's still worth being able to categorize it so that you know what you're going to be talking about when you go before the judge. Now, also, this would matter if you or a group of people are involved in the potential for litigation against a government agency for committing some wrongdoing. It's very helpful if you know what these different categories are on the violations, whether it's malfeasance, whether it's misfeasance, or nonfeasance. And it's important to accurately identify that to increase the success that you would have if you're going to try to bring an action like that against them. So hopefully you understand. I'm hopeful that this is a good enough information that you'll understand the difference. Again, in summary, both malfeasance and misfeasance usually require action to be taken. Malfeasance is the worst. It requires illegal, willful action, usually causing harm to people. Misfeasance is action that's oftentimes legal, but it's unintentional harm, or it's a mistake that was made by an elected official. And nonfeasance is just the everyday, average, ordinary situation that we find in government on a regular basis, where you just decide to fail to do your job even though that job requires certain actions in the law. So hopefully this video helps you understand that, and I hope you feel free to share this with other people. If you want to learn more about specific cases of malfeasance and misfeasance and nonfeasance, feel free to go to wethegovern.com. Also, subscribe to this channel if you want to see more videos about this or other topics that are on a similar bandwidth. And remember, as activists and as people who are involved in government and trying to make a difference in the communities where you live, the future does belong to those who show up.